Dawn broke over a field near Manila, the air heavy with the smell of wet grass and diesel. It was August of 1945, and the war was all but over. Yet for the small group of Japanese nurses and clerks huddled under a torn U.S. tent, surrender did not feel like peace. Boots crunched over the mud, American boots, and the women straightened instinctively, eyes fixed on the horizon. They still wore their faded khaki uniforms, sleeves torn, insignias scraped off. But that last symbol of duty was about to be stripped away. A U.S. sergeant, barely 20, 2 barked orders, uniforms off. The translator hesitated before repeating it in Japanese. Silence fell, then disbelief. The women froze, unsure if they had understood correctly. One of them, Lieutenant Yamada, whispered, "We are nurses, not prisoners." A guard raised his rifle slightly. The moment stretched like wire about to snap. One by one, trembling hands began to unbutton, fold, surrender. The fabric clung to their damp skin before dropping into piles at the soldiers' boots. Around them the camp buzzed. Jeeps rumbling, typewriters clacking, men shouting over supply lists. None of it belonged to them anymore. The nurses stood in undergarments, eyes down, hearts hammering. For the first time, the ones who had stitched battlefield wounds now stood as wounds themselves, exposed, silent, stripped of rank and language. Records estimate that more than 300,000 Japanese were captured in the Pacific Theater, but less than 1% were women. Their capture wasn't part of any manual, no rules written for dignity. The guards looked uneasy. Even victory had its shadows. We thought death would be kinder than this. One survivor would later write. Then came the final humiliation. A corporal brought a bundle rough brown paper bags meant for potatoes. He tossed them onto the ground. For decency, he muttered, half apologetic, half indifferent. The women stared at the crumpled sacks, their edges greasy and torn. No seams, no strings, no dignity, yet this was all they were allowed to wear. As they bent to pick up the bags, the paper crackled in the wind like dry leaves. A single thought passed between them without words. If this was mercy, what did cruelty look like? The sky above shimmered with heat, and as they slipped those paper bags over their bodies, the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came fast, thick, tropical, relentless. Within minutes, the paper bags clung to their bodies like soaked skin. What was meant to hide them now revealed every shiver, every contour, every ounce of shame. The guards laughed, some awkwardly, some cruelly, as the women tried to hold the edges closed with trembling hands. Brown pulp smeared down their arms. The smell of wet paper mixed with sweat and diesel fuel, turning the camp into a scene of slow humiliation under a curtain of rain. The bags had been made for potatoes, not people. Coarse, fragile, printed with the U.S. Army Supply insignia. Each one tore along the folds as the women tried to walk. Lieutenant Yamada clutched hers at the sides, whispering to the younger girls, "Move slowly. Don't let it rip." But the heat made it impossible. The humidity hovered near 90%, and the temperature over 33 degrees Celsius pressed down like punishment. The women's breath came out in ragged gasps. The paper began to dissolve against their skin. A sergeant barked for them to stand in line for inspection. Boots splashed through puddles. A few soldiers looked away, others smirked. One camera clicked. The lens caught a moment no one was supposed to see half. Mirrored faces, paper collapsing around them, humanity hanging by threads of pulp and rainwater. The paper melted faster than our pride. One woman would later write in her testimony, Inside one of the tents, an American private wiped the fog from his rifle scope and muttered, "Jesus, this ain't right." His friend shrugged, adjusting his helmet. "Orders are orders." But even he didn't meet the women's eyes. Across the camp, the storm roared, drowning every sound except the flutter of paper in the wind. By nightfall, the bags were nothing more than mush. The women huddled together under the tin roof of an abandoned shed, shivering. Some used scraps of cardboard to cover their legs. Yamada pressed her palm against the dripping wall and whispered, "Tomorrow we ask for cloth." No one answered. The rain kept falling, and somewhere in the darkness the camp's doctor, just returning from the field hospital, stopped short at the sight before him. Women, soaked and trembling, wrapped in paper and silence. He turned toward his tent, already reaching for his medical log. By dawn, the storm had turned the camp into a swamp of mud and silence. The canvas tents sagged under the weight of last night's rain, ropes humming faintly in the wind. The Japanese women sat in the open, paper clinging to their skin like second flesh. Steam rose from puddles as the sun clawed its way through low gray clouds. The guards moved about their morning duties, trying not to look too long. What had started as an order now looked like cruelty unfolding in slow motion. A corporal with a southern accent muttered, "They'll catch fever." The sergeant beside him replied flatly, "Not our problem. Command says minimal resources." Even so, a few soldiers began leaving scraps: an old blanket, a corner of canvas, a torn shirt. Anything to cover what conscience couldn't ignore. One of the women, Yamada again, tore her sack into strips to share with two younger girls. The edges bled brown onto their fingers. When a guard approached, she stood tall, chin raised, eyes like knives. He hesitated, then looked away. In that tiny pause, she found a sliver of control, an invisible act of defiance. Rain returned in bursts through the morning, soft but relentless. Drops hit the metal roofs like machine gun fire. The women crouched under makeshift lean, toss of paper and wood, water seeping in through every gap. The camp smelled of wet rope, rust, and despair. We were naked before the sky, and it judged us all. One later recalled. At midday, the doctor arrived, Captain Harris, medical officer, 31 years old. He stopped dead at the sight. 20 women, soaked and shaking, paper dissolving into skin. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he ordered his medic to fetch towels and antiseptic. The guards stared in disbelief. "Sir, those are prisoners," one said. Harris shot back, "They're humans first." His voice was calm, dangerous. He walked the line, checking each woman for fever, infection, or wounds reopened by exposure. His jaw tightened as he scribbled in his logbook. Immediate need for clothing. The ink blurred where rain hit the page. When he closed the book, he already knew what would happen next. The request would be filed, reviewed, and ignored. But he filed it anyway. Captain Harris barely slept that night. The rain had stopped, but the images refused to leave his mind. Skin blistered by friction, paper fused into wounds, eyes that no longer blinked from shock. His tent smelled of iodine and damp canvas. Outside, the camp generator hummed, slicing the darkness into restless fragments of sound. He sat at his field desk, typing under the flicker of a lantern. Medical emergency. Japanese female prisoners require immediate clothing and shelter. He signed the report 3 times, sealing it with mud. Stained hands, but he knew better. In 1945, Paperwork was the quietest way to bury compassion. Still, he couldn't let it go. If they die of infection, it's on us. He told his orderly, a kid barely out of high school. The boy nodded, eyes darting toward the tents outside where the women slept in silence. At first light, Harris walked to the camp commander's office, a shack of plywood and maps. The commander skimmed the report, jaw tight. "You've seen the memos. Supplies go to the front, not to the enemy." Harris shot back. "They're not soldiers. They're nurses, civilians. This violates every article of Geneva." The commander's eyes hardened. "Geneva didn't see what they did in Baton." A pause. "Case closed, doctor." Harris left without saluting. His boots sank deep into the mud, every step heavier. Around him, men loaded crates marked medical priority onto trucks, bound for the front line. Bandages, morphine, antibiotics, all heading toward men still fighting battles already decided. The math was obscene. 12 supply trucks for soldiers, 1 for prisoners, if that. That night, Harris visited the women again. He brought antiseptic, bandages, and what little linen he could steal from the infirmary. The women sat quietly, paper clinging to them like ghosts. "Even the enemy's doctor pitied us." One would later write in a post, war testimony. He didn't speak Japanese, but when he covered Yamada's shoulder with a strip of cloth, her eyes met his, defiant, grateful, unreadable. He went back to his tent and opened a new report, this time addressed directly to headquarters. The last line read, "Neglect is not victory." He sent it off at dawn, knowing it would vanish in the same paper maze as all the others. By afternoon, a clerk in Manila stamped it in red ink. Rejected. In a narrow office miles away. The paper moved faster than the people it was meant to help. Manila headquarters rows of clerks, hunched under ceiling fans, typing orders that no one would ever read twice. Captain Harris's request for clothing arrived there just after noon. It was logged, stamped, filed, and forgotten in under 4 minutes. The justification was mechanical, non-essential item, supply shortage, denied. The stamp hit the page with a thud that sounded final, like a door slamming shut. The clerk who stamped it didn't even look up. He'd processed hundreds of similar pleas that week requests for shoes, blankets, disinfectant. But the numbers told their own story. Front line troops received 12 times more supply weight than prisoners. In war arithmetic, humanity didn't count as logistics. He exhaled through his cigarette, smudging the ash over a name he couldn't pronounce, Yamada. Back at the camp, Harris received the rejection the next day. He read it twice, his jaw tightening. Outside, the women stood in formation, still wrapped in paper and rags. The sun beat down, sharp and merciless. Flies clung to their arms. He tore the top corner of the memo and threw it into the mud. Bureaucrats win wars on paper. He muttered, but paper's killing them too. The guards were restless. Orders had been clear, no aid, no deviation. But even they began to look uneasy. One young corporal said quietly, "Sir, they'll rot if we don't do something." Another replied, "Then we'll rot with them. Orders are orders." The words echoed the same cruelty that paper carried obedience without ownership. That evening, the women tried to clean themselves at the edge of the camp, using rainwater pooled in oil drums. The paper sloughed away like brown skin. They whispered to each other in broken fragments of prayer and memory. One murmured, "Even paper forgets what it was made for." Inside his tent, Harris poured a cup of black coffee, gone cold, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere, typewriters kept clacking, issuing more rejections to more desperate voices. He felt the walls closing in the same silence that wrapped every decision made from comfort. But not everyone in the camp could ignore it. Near the guard hut, one sergeant stared out at the women and whispered, "Hell with orders." The next morning he acted. Sergeant Miller wasn't supposed to care. His orders were simple: maintain discipline, log rations, no fraternization with prisoners. But after 2 weeks of watching the Japanese women shiver under paper sacks, something in him cracked. The moment came one morning when he saw Yamada collapse while carrying a bucket of water. Her paper clothing disintegrated as she fell, mud splashing up her arms. No one moved. Miller did. He marched to the supply shed, kicked open a crate marked Rice U.S. Army issue, and pulled out the burlap sacks. The fibers were rough, the smell earthy and raw. He tore one open, feeling the grit under his nails. "Hell, this'll do," he muttered. That night, when the guards rotated shifts, he carried the sacks to the women's enclosure, dumping them quietly near the fence. No one saw anything. He whispered. The women didn't move at first, too shocked to trust mercy. Then Yamada stepped forward, bowed slightly, and began distributing the sacks. The next hour became a ritual of silent creation. They tore, cut, tied, turned burlap into crude tunics. Strands of rice fiber brushed their skin like salvation. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't smell like shame. It smelled like work, like purpose. A rough sack felt like silk. One survivor later wrote, "Under the pale moonlight, the women's silhouettes moved like shadows, sewing their own humanity back together." Miller watched from a distance, arms folded, jaw set. He knew if the commander found out, he'd be court-martialed. But he also knew this: no war regulation could explain away conscience. As he turned to leave, one of the women pressed her palms together in silent gratitude. He nodded once and disappeared into the darkness. By sunrise, the camp looked different. The paper remnants were gone, replaced by burlap stitched with makeshift cords. Even the guards noticed. One muttered, "Looks almost normal." Another spat in the dirt but didn't interfere. The quiet defiance spread through the morning air like smoke. That afternoon Harris walked past and paused. He didn't ask who did it. He just wrote one word in his report, improvised. In the corner, 2 women crouched, threading fibers together with fish bones. Their hands moved with rhythm, precision, and something else was beginning. By the 3rd night, the women had turned the burlap into a kind of uniform, coarse, uneven, but theirs. The act of sewing became something more than survival. It was quiet rebellion. They used fish bones scavenged from the camp kitchen as needles, pulling thin threads of twine through the heavy weave. Every stitch was a statement. You can strip us, but you can't erase us. Under the weak light of an oil drum fire, Yamada led the work. Her fingers were blistered, but she didn't stop. "Make it neat," she whispered. "Neat is dignity." Around her, 20 women sewed in rhythm, the soft scrape of bone through cloth, the crackle of fire, the far-off hum of a generator. In a world that had taken everything, this rhythm gave them back a pulse. From the guard tower, Sergeant Miller watched, pretending to smoke. He noticed how organized they'd become, sharing scraps, rotating tasks, cutting threads with the edges of tin cans. He smiled grimly. "They're soldiers again," he murmured. Beneath him, Private Lang leaned over the railing. "Ain't they supposed to be broken?" Miller didn't answer. Reports later described the Japanese military's textile shortages, how even soldiers in Tokyo were reusing fabric. turning old uniforms into bandages. In that sense, these women were living echoes of an empire already unraveling. "We rebuilt dignity from trash," one said decades later. By dawn, the burlap tunics were finished. They hung loose, tied with strips of paper cord. When the women walked to roll call, they didn't look like prisoners anymore. Something subtle had shifted. Their backs straight, their eyes level. The guards noticed, and unease crept through the camp like fog. That afternoon the camp commander stopped by. He frowned at the burlap clothing, jaw tight. Who authorized this? No one spoke. Yamada stepped forward, her voice steady. "We made them ourselves." The commander's glare lingered before he turned to Miller. "You allow this?" Miller said nothing. "Then they'll learn obedience again." The commander snapped. The punishment order came before sunset. All women to appear for inspection at noon the next day, wearing paper only. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. The women, meanwhile, folded their burlap garments neatly, ready to lose them again, but not the defiance stitched into them. And when noon came, the camp gathered for the cruel parade. Noon hit like a hammer. The sun burned white above the camp, flattening shadows, baking the ground into cracked clay. The women stood in formation once again, stripped of their burlap, back in paper sacks that barely clung to their skin. Each sack was stamped with faded black lettering, U.S. Army potatoes. The paper rustled in the dry wind, mocking the silence between them. The guards lined up too, uneasy beneath the heat. A jeep arrived, raising dust. Inside sat the camp commander and two unfamiliar men wearing clean khaki shirts and carrying cameras. "Documentation unit," one of the guards whispered. The women didn't move. The cameras clicked, the dry, mechanical sound cutting through the air like gunfire. The commander's voice carried. Discipline must be visible. Even mercy must have rules. The order was simple: march. Bare feet slapped against the dirt, paper tearing with every step. Some stumbled, others bit their lips until they bled. Sweat ran down their backs, soaking the fragile sacks until they stuck to their skin. Laughter rippled from the younger guards, half forced, half nervous. The lenses kept turning, catching faces that should never have been filmed. Our shame became someone's footage, one survivor said later. At the edge of the parade ground, Sergeant Miller stood motionless. His fists were clenched behind his back, knuckles white. Captain Harris watched beside him, jaw locked. "They're filming this," Harris hissed. "Propaganda," Miller muttered. "They'll call it proof of humane treatment." Neither man could look away. The women marched on, silent, steady, defiant even in degradation. By the time it ended, the paper hung in tatters. The commander nodded to the cameramen. "That's enough." They packed up the reels, smiling thinly. The guards herded the women back toward their quarters. One stumbled, fell to her knees, paper splitting down the middle. No one helped her up until Miller stepped forward. He reached down, lifted her gently, and whispered, "I'm sorry." That night, while others slept, one of the cameramen, Private Jenkins, sat alone in the darkroom tent. He watched the wet film curling on its spool, ghostly figures flickering in the dim red light. For the first time, he couldn't tell who the enemy really was. Private Robert Jenkins had filmed plenty of things since landing in the Pacific: burned villages, captured soldiers, victory parades, but nothing like this. That night, inside the darkroom tent, the red light flickered as strips of wet film dripped from a makeshift clothesline. He leaned close to the negatives and froze. The images were haunting. Women walking in paper, faces hollow yet unbroken. Not victims exactly, but not enemies either. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling through the red haze, and whispered, "They didn't look like enemies." The next morning, the reels were scheduled for shipment to Manila for official review. Jenkins watched the metal canisters being sealed with wax, his name stamped on each one. "Good work, Private," said the propaganda officer. "These'll go down in history." Jenkins nodded mechanically, but the words felt like rust in his mouth. That afternoon, he developed one reel for backup. The moment the first image appeared on the screen, Yamada, standing tall despite the shredded paper around her, he felt something twist inside him. He scribbled in his diary, "Captured women, not proud, not safe, just human." His hand trembled. Around camp, life moved on as if nothing had happened. Soldiers joked, trucks rumbled, typewriters clacked. But Jenkins found himself staring at the women whenever he passed their enclosure. They never looked away, and that quiet defiance burned into his memory stronger than any bullet or explosion. He wasn't the only one unsettled. Even Sergeant Miller had stopped eating with the others. "You seen the prints?" Jenkins asked one night. Miller nodded. "I saw enough. Those pictures'll outlive us all." Then he added softly, "if they ever get out." The thought stuck. At midnight, Jenkins crept back into the darkroom, the camp silent except for the drone of insects. He unlatched one canister and stared at the reel coiled inside. A silent witness the military would soon classify, edit, and bury. He made a choice then, swift and dangerous. He swapped one reel with a blank, sealing the canister again. The stolen film went into his pack, wrapped in a sock, hidden under a photo of his fiancée back home. At dawn, the convoy left with the official reels. Jenkins stood by the gate, sweat on his neck, pretending not to breathe. That night he wrote a single line in his journal. One man's evidence, another's awakening. When Jenkins shipped out months later, the war was officially over. Manila was a graveyard of victory, half ruins, half celebration. The reel stayed hidden in his duffel bag, smuggled past inspection, wrapped in layers of cloth and silence. He told no one, not his commanding officer, not his fiancée, Sarah, waiting in Kentucky. The guilt felt heavier than the medals pinned to his chest. In 1946, he came home a hero. The local paper ran his picture under the headline, "Pacific Cameraman Returns." Neighbors shook his hand, strangers thanked him, but he barely spoke. He worked in a garage, drank too much coffee, and woke at night to the sound of phantom rain on tin roofs. The reel sat untouched in a wooden box under his bed, labeled only, "Do not open." Years passed. Jenkins married, had a son, grew old in quiet anonymity. He never once mentioned the film. Sometimes, on stormy nights, he'd pull out the box, stare at the label, and put it back again. His wife would find him sitting in the dark, cigarette ash spilling onto his uniform trousers. "Old dreams?" She'd ask. He'd just nod. In 1950, too, a flood hit their town. As Sarah packed their belongings for evacuation, she found the box. The tape inside smelled faintly of vinegar and rust. She lifted the lid, curiosity outweighing warning. When she held the film up to the light, ghostly faces flickered through the translucent strip. Women wrapped in paper, eyes defiant. She called out his name, but Jenkins was standing behind her already, pale, shaking his head. "Some stories," he whispered, "ain't supposed to stay buried." He took the reel gently from her hands, drying it with a towel like something sacred. That night he threaded it through an old projector in their living room. The flicker filled the walls. Grainy, silent, cruelly beautiful. For minutes neither spoke. When the film ended, Sarah's face was wet with tears. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. Jenkins stared at the empty reel spinning in the dark. "Because they wouldn't have believed me." He hid it again, this time in a metal tin sealed tight. Decades later, after his death, it would be found by his grandson, its label still legible, its images still intact, despite the years. By the 1980s, The war had faded into museum displays and black and white documentaries. Most veterans were gray, haired or gone. The paper bag story, like so many fragments of cruelty and mercy, had vanished into the bureaucratic fog, until one afternoon a team of Japanese historians searching through U.S. military archives in Manila stumbled on a logbook from an unlisted detention site. The entry was brief, almost casual: issued paper sacks to females. Internees temporary measure, no details, no apology, just paper acknowledging paper. The historians froze. One of them, Professor Takagi, whispered, "Could this be the camp?" The coordinates matched roughly to a site south of Manila, Camp 15B, officially erased after 1946. They dug deeper, tracing supply manifests, photo rolls, and fragments of correspondence from Captain Harris. In one memo, the phrase "neglect is not victory" appeared. It was the first living voice in the record. When they reached the physical site weeks later, it was overgrown tangled bamboo, rusted barbed wire, half-buried ration tins, but some evidence refused to rot. A piece of rotted wood still carried faint white lettering, "POW area." The air smelled of damp earth and old ghosts. A local farmer said his father once saw women kept there, dressed in bags, not clothes. It was the confirmation the archives lacked. Back in Tokyo, the discovery caused quiet shock among scholars but little public reaction. War memory in Japan was selective heroic stories celebrated, humiliations buried. We were ghosts in the archive. One surviving nurse would later say when shown the photographs. Her eyes trembled as she traced a fingertip over a grainy still of women marching in paper. "I was there," she whispered. Only 30. Some first-hand testimony from Japanese women, POW, have survived history's decay. Most spoke not of violence, but of humiliation as policy, the deliberate stripping of self. The rediscovered Manila documents, paired with Jenkins's hidden reel, formed the missing half of a story neither side had fully owned. In a Tokyo University basement, a young historian watched the footage for the first time. The flicker of paper, the women's faces, the rain, all preserved on brittle celluloid. When the screen went dark, she sat in silence. Then she made a call to NHK Oral History Project. "We found them," she said. Paper bag women. And somewhere, far from Tokyo, one survivor finally agreed to speak. The camera trembled slightly as it focused on her face. 80, 3 years old, hair silver, hands folded neatly. In her lap, Yamada Keiko, the nurse once known only as Prisoner Number 11, sat beneath the studio lights of NHK Oral History Project. It was 1991, nearly half a century since she'd stood in the Manila mud wearing a paper sack. She spoke softly, each word carrying the weight of decades. It was not the hunger, she said, not the heat. It was the shame. Paper on skin, and the eyes watching. The interviewer let silence hang. Behind the glass, the producer watched through headphones, frozen. Yamada continued, describing how the paper would crumble against their bodies when it rained, how the guards looked away not from disgust but guilt. "We were invisible until our humiliation made us visible," she said. Reports from NHK Oral Project note that between 1991 and 1994, fewer than 40 Japanese female POW came forward. Many refused to appear on camera, afraid of ridicule or erasure. But Yamada insisted. "If I die with this story unspoken," she told the interviewer, "then the shame wins twice." Her voice cracked only once, when describing the moment she saw Captain Harris look at her like a patient, not a prisoner. It was the first time mercy felt heavier than punishment. She whispered. Her testimony ran for 2 hours. She spoke of the burlap, of sewing by firelight, of the day the American with the camera looked away. When shown a still image from Jenkins's hidden reel, She gasped quietly. "That was me," she said. "You see, even paper remembers." Afterward, the crew sat in silence. The director finally whispered, "This changes everything." Within months, the footage and interviews began circulating through Japanese and American media. Newspapers printed stills, talk shows debated culpability, viewers wept, others protested, claiming exaggeration. But something irreversible had begun. The ghosts were now witnesses. When Yamada left the studio that day, she paused at the door, looking back at the crew. "It wasn't hatred that broke us," she said softly. "It was humiliation." The translator repeated her words in English, voice trembling. They hung in the room like smoke. Outside, the evening sky was gray with rain. And in Tokyo's museums, curators began to search their archives for a single paper sack. By the early 1990s, the story of the paper bag women had cracked open something raw in both Japan and the United States. News anchors debated ethics and wartime policy. Historians scrambled to verify the rediscovered footage, and veterans wrote letters defending or denouncing what had happened. The war that was supposed to be over had returned in whispers, headlines, and museum exhibits. In Tokyo, the National War Remembrance Committee called an emergency session. The question wasn't just about evidence, it was about representation. Should humiliation be displayed? Should the paper sacks themselves be shown to the public? One curator argued, "To show it is to shame the dead again." Another countered, "To hide it is to kill them a second time." The debate stretched for hours. Cameras rolled, tempers flared. Across the Pacific, American journalists quoted Captain Harris's report, now declassified. "Neglect is not victory." Public sentiment in Japan shifted overnight. Thousands of viewers wrote letters to NHK, thanking Yamada and the surviving women for their courage. Schools requested copies of the broadcast for history lessons, but in the Diet, conservative lawmakers called it unpatriotic revisionism. Even the surviving veterans' associations were split. "We all suffered," one statement read, "but not all suffering was seen." Statistical research from the period estimated that over 10,000 Japanese women had served in occupied territories during the war. Only a few hundred ever made it home. Most left no record, no graves. "We wanted no revenge, only remembrance," Yamada said during a follow-up interview. Her words echoed through lecture halls, protest marches, and museum walls. In Washington, D.C., a Smithsonian curator contacted NHK to request one of the remaining burlap garments. His letter reads simply, "This story belongs to all who served and suffered, not to one nation." But the Japanese committee refused. The relics would stay in Tokyo, they said, where the silence began. That winter, the National Museum of Modern History unveiled its new exhibit. In the center stood a single object under glass, a brown, frayed paper sack, its texture mottled by age and sweat stains. Visitors filed past in hushed disbelief. Schoolchildren leaned close, staring at the faint English words printed across it, U.S. "Army potatoes," one boy whispered to his teacher. "It's just paper." She replied quietly, "That's why it matters." And as the lights dimmed for closing, the glass case reflected its final visitor, Yamada herself, frail, steady, unblinking. The paper sack sits now in a climate-controlled glass case inside the Tokyo National Museum of Modern History. Visitors lower their voices as they approach it, unsure if they're looking at an artifact or a wound. The object is small, creased, stained, edges frayed where fingers once clutched to keep it from falling apart. Under the museum lights, its brown surface glows faintly, and the faint black letters still read, U.S. Army Potatoes. A conservator in white gloves adjusts the humidity dial each morning. The cellulose fibers are more than 70% decayed. The paper could disintegrate with a single careless touch. It held nothing but our humanity, Yamada had said before her death in 2002. The words are printed on a placard beside the display. Tourists take photos, though most end up lowering their cameras halfway, realizing no picture can translate the air of quiet guilt that hangs around the case. Children whisper questions their parents can't quite answer. Veterans from both sides sometimes leave flowers, white chrysanthemums, wilted carnations, even a folded American flag. The museum staff never remove them until the petals fall on their own. The war lives in what survives, one curator said in a recorded guide, even when survival looks like paper. Across the room, a looping screen plays fragments from Jenkins's Real Women Marching in the Rain, faces blurred by film grain, defiance flickering through the scratches of celluloid. The sound is muted, but you can almost hear the storm, the rustle of bags, the command barked off screen. In another display, Captain Harris's report lies open beneath glass, the ink still legible. Neglect is not victory. Visitors often pause between the two exhibits, the film and the sack, realizing they are watching both cause and consequence. The footage shows humiliation. The paper shows endurance. Together they whisper what the archives never could. That shame recorded can also become memory preserved. Every evening, when the museum lights dim, the glass case catches reflections of departing visitors' faces overlapping the ghostly outline of the sack. The janitor swears it almost seems to breathe when the air conditioner hums. And outside, as the city lights flicker across Tokyo Bay, the night wind presses gently against the museum windows like rain, returning to a place that once knew paper and pain.